over and over and over again, we find that at the root of team and organizational success, you have to focus on culture. In a group with good psychological safety, there is a substantially larger emphasis not on who did the wrong thing, but what do we need to learn. Whereas if you want to know if your team's doing a good job, go ask them how effective do you think we're doing compared to that team? Go get peer reviews from other teams, from your clients. Talk to people. Stop pretending that you can average everything.
Let's think about from the shoes of a manager, right? Part of the reason I say I don't envy them, it's their life is hard too, because they have to prove out as a team we are performing well.
Right.
How do you know as a manager that you're running a high performing team?
I don't think that there is a way to objectively define that.
Welcome, folks. On today's episode of Hanger DX podcast, we have with us Titus, joining from Adobe, and has had a long career at Google as well. And I'm really excited for today's session because this is going to be very unique and different than many of our conversations in the past. We're going to talk about psychological safety and fear in tech. So before we get started, Titus, please introduce yourself to the audience, and we'll straight up dive into the topic after that.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much for having me on, Keith. So I'm Titus Winters. People might know me from my history at Google. I was there for about 13 years running C++ common libraries, education, training. I did a few years service on the C++ standards committee. I chaired the working group for the design and evolution of the standard library in the basically C++ 20 timeframe. About a year and a half ago, I left Google. I've been working at Adobe as a senior principal scientist responsible for developer experience. Largely, I continue to just be in the business of how do you make a large legacy-ish tech company productive? So my mission is very much do whatever it takes to improve productivity and consistency and platforming for Adobe engineers writ large. I always say, developer experience is a polite fiction. We're in the business of productivity. We're just wise enough to know that you can't measure productivity, and experience is the best proxy for it. But the answer to developer experience is not donuts and ponies. It's, we got to get the right tools. We got to get the right processes. And to the point of today's episode, got to get the right culture.
Amazing. Obviously, maybe one day we can also do another session on tools, but I feel like with your background and all the things that I've read and seen about your work, psychology and culture is certainly one thing we want to dive into.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about what is your understanding of engineering culture, and kind of where does that fit into developer experience?
Right. So a lot of what I take as a given kind of boils down to, where the research points us. And if you go back to DORA research, Accelerate, all of these things that we've been talking about for 10 years, and hopefully people are, following the research, over and over and over again, we find that at the root of team and organizational success, you have to focus on culture. The DORA research showed that. Even earlier Google research showed that. If you search for Project Aristotle, there's still New York Times articles and things about Google's research into what makes teams productive. And the story there is, I think, really illustrative. The sponsors for that study and the initial, hypotheses of the researchers were oh, it's going to be about you get, well-funded teams of experts and you take all of the hurdles out of their way, and then that's what makes them successful. No, I could not find any statistical backing for that assertion. The thing that comes up is you got to get psychological safety down, and then you got to get people actually follow through on what they commit. And technically they came up with bullet points 3 and 4, but nobody actually remembers what 3 and 4 are. Most of the time you don't even remember what number 2 is, because if you get the psychological safety thing right, the rest of it just kind of starts to fall into place. And I just cannot find research anywhere that doesn't say psychological safety and a culture focused on growth and learning for your frontline developer teams is the primary indicator and predictor and foundation for technical success. Like, everything else is just your opinion, man. Like the research receipts are very consistent on this point. So
Amazing. So you've obviously seen software engineering evolve quite a lot, and I feel like, things are just getting much crazier lately.
yes.
How have you seen sort of like this, like in some ways we're talking about fear in tech, this fear in
Yeah.
tech, this psychological safety or this cultural aspect evolve in the last few years? And kind of like, do you think it's getting better or is it getting worse?
I think it depends. Like, I think that the fact that we can use psychological safety, at least in some circles, as just a term of art and people know what you're talking about, is indicative of we're pushing in the right direction. That's great. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that are pushing us backwards on fear questions. Geopolitics might factor in a little bit. But also, even like there's great studies on the advent of Gen AI and fear in tech, just as a response to, are we all about to lose our jobs because the machines are coming for us? One of the researchers that I absolutely adore is Dr. Kat Hicks. There's a paper from her a little bit ago that has stats. I probably won't get the stats perfectly right, but and it's in her research, 44% of the engineering community baseline believes that Gen AI is going to come take their jobs. On teams that have proper psychological safety and like learning, culture built in and in place, that number is less than half, right? And their use of those tools is more playful and, useful and valuable. And like, even the biggest fads in tech discourse right now, around AI and AI coding assistants and all of these things, really still boil down to, you got to get the psychological safety pieces in place if you want this to work. All roads lead to culture.
Okay. Let's kind of like, before diving too far into it, let's try to define what psychological safety is.
Yeah.
Maybe you can kind of like take an attempt at like within engineering teams, how do you define psychological safety? And also maybe kind of like for gut check for teams themselves, like how do they know like if they lack psychological safety?
Right. So I think the most common sorts of definitions here focus on psychological safety is the state where everyone on the team feels comfortable to put out an idea that might not work, admit that they don't know something, make an honest, novel mistake, ask questions, not fit in with the group, not know something that everyone else on the group knows, right? And that, that sounds great, but is not a thing that you get for free. Like, you got to, it takes some active effort to get there. Another way that I really like looking at it is, in a group with good psychological safety, there is a substantially larger emphasis not on who did the wrong thing, but what do we need to learn? Like shifting things away from, blame is huge, but really putting a very positive amount of energy on how do we learn and grow, both individually and collectively. What opportunities do we have for, oh, yeah, there's a thing missing here. Let's codify that. Let's make that work. I think those are really, really big and are tied up in the same thing. Interestingly, the only thing that anyone finds that might be more foundational, more predictive, I guess, of team and organizational success than culture is documentation. And my theory around, and that's not, I don't believe, user-facing documentation, it's internal documentation. And my theory for that is actually the same point of trying to build towards a place where people, just take the fear and stress out of them, make it easy to learn. But a lot of it is, how do you codify what the rules and practices and norms on your team actually look like. Write those things down. How do we want to treat each other? What do we commit ourselves to? How do you use our internal tools? Like, what's the policies around sick time or picking up a kid? Just getting those things written down is part of the culture, and clarifying the putting words down for the unasked questions puts everyone on a more level footing and takes away some of the fear that gets in the way.
Interesting. So I'm going to go back to maybe second part of the question, which I was asking before. Like, are there clear signs that people, or like even I think even for managers, right? They can notice that there isn't enough psychological safety in the team, and then they can kind of like maybe have like more actionable steps towards how do we make that better?
Yeah. There are really nice and pretty short like survey instruments that you can like do as a team exercise, like 12, 15, 20 sort of questions that will give you a pretty solid signal on like how is this actually going. But other sort of indicators, if you got people that just are never going to speak up, like would rather not, like even if the conversation is going wrong or they know the answer, they're not going to volunteer it until they're asked. Like that is a person that is not engaged and maybe is afraid of being out of turn or judged or something like that. I think the more that we focus on, if managers and leaders don't see people asking a lot of questions, then either it's not happening or they're finding places to ask those questions that are invisible. And that's indicative of something that's a little concerning,
Let's think about like high performing teams, right? Like they're working under pressure, tight deadlines. How does like psychological safety play out with that? And is there like sort of like a balance with urgency, or how kind of like that operates in such an organization or such a culture?
So let's see. Going to the DORA formulation behind all of this, DORA evaluates culture along there's a theory, it's the Westrom theory of organizational culture, where there's kind of three major modes for teams to be in. There's a power-oriented, do what I say because I said so. There's a rules-oriented, these are what the rules are, sort of, bureaucracy. And there's a outcomes-oriented, someone might be in charge and there might be rules, but we might ignore those things to run an experiment, to aim for that outcome. Like, why are we not doing the things that make sense that would get us there? And I think it's really clear that outcomes-focused culture is behind the teams that are actually high-performing. And if you find yourself in that type of environment, and you're in those high-pressure situations where, okay, yes, there's a deadline, or yes, there's a CSO, it's much easier to know that you can ask questions. It's much easier to know that your team has your back and you're not being blamed for the thing that went wrong. This is all also super tied up with SRE culture and rules around blameless postmortems. It's not a matter of point fingers at who brought down the server. It's a matter of do the investigation and triage to figure out why it was even possible to bring down the server in the first place. Fix that bug. The concern that I sometimes get when I go out and preach psychological safety is like, well, but we want people to be good at their job, and this is just giving them permission to like screw things up all the time. I'm like, no. Like, you do need to make sure that your people are committed to the mission, and you absolutely need to prevent them from making the same stupid mistake again and again, right? But there has to be an awareness of the difference between an honest, novel mistake, one where like, nope, well, that wasn't on our radar. Like, we just discovered that the system has that new failure mode. I guess we'll fix that. versus someone that just, keeps breaking the build with every PR. Like, one of those is actually a management issue, and the other one is just normal operating procedure. Like, I used to, in team meeting rituals, I often focus on, we do one ritual around kudos. Everyone just go around, like, give thanks for the, people that helped you out, surface the invisible work that managers wouldn't necessarily otherwise see. This makes, peer reviews and annual performance reviews a little bit more nuanced. But also the second ritual is the monkey of, like, what's the biggest mistake you made this week, right? And we want to normalize that. Yeah, you should, like, it's okay to make mistakes, right? And if it's a thing that really matters, we need to go fix it, or we need to learn from it at least. And I find that if your teams are kind of just phoning it in and not making any interesting mistakes, that's itself an indicator of, like, there might well be cultural issues and fear on the team, like, or you're just not challenging them, like, right? Like, a high performing team needs some challenge, needs some push, needs to be pushed. So
Very cool. So there is this notion of ideas coming top down, or like execution sort of like top down versus like bottoms up. Do you think it is also related to psychological safety? Can there be a culture where you have a very top down type of operating model, but you still have psychological safety?
I think that there certainly can be. It depends. It certainly depends on your leaders. Like, there are some types of top-down behavior that is going to crush psychological safety. But if it is a matter of, hey, this is important, go take that hill, or this is important, go make this product happen, right? Where leaders are giving direction, yeah, great. Like, that's not incompatible with teams finding their own ways to operate and building up those positive cultures. When it's a leader that's micromanaging every decision and, trying to be the one that breaks ties or, makes snap decision engineering judgments without all of the background, like, that doesn't go well. That's going to lead to a lot of mistakes and mistrust and those types of things. We have to avoid the top-down power dynamics sorts of environments, because they don't work. Like, they seem very satisfying for people that do have power, but if everyone is afraid of upsetting the boss, or not hitting the next deadline, or any, like, just gathering attention. Like, if you're in an environment where keep your head down, don't make waves is what you have to do just to get through the day, you're probably not going to be all that innovative or creative or high performance, right?
Interesting. Okay. So there is also like this, in some ways, senior engineers or like engineering leaders who are like not even managers, they can probably also help foster a little bit more culture of psychological safety. Like, so they're like not people manager directly or like responsible for like people's performance. Do you have like some examples or thoughts on like what they can do to create like a more open work environment?
Right. So I think that from above, whether it's management or just, respected leaders, I think it's really important to talk about these things and to, demonstrate a commitment to being good to each other, and that culture matters. Like, culture is part of the job. It's not a luxury, right? I think it's really important to get, leaders as high up as you can to be on the record saying you deserve to have a strong, culture on your team and a supportive working environment. But they can't actually fix it directly, because it's really the emergent behavior of, like, the people that you're closest to, like shoulder to shoulder, that they're interacting with on a daily basis. And so what I often find is got to get those leaders to tell people that it's okay, but then it has to actually, the work starts from the ground up.
Right.
And to that end, there's been a lot of discussion around, team working agreements is a thing that I hear about. Like, what are our commitments to each other? Like, what do we look for in code review? What's our turnaround time in code review? What hours do we expect each other to be available for questions on Slack? Like, just putting those things, again, down on paper or in Markdown, like, is a step towards doing that. There's another thing that I really believe in, which is if you look at like group dynamics, psychology research, those sorts of things, it's very natural for anyone to kind of overestimate how much the group disagrees with their personal beliefs and values and direction, priorities, when the group isn't talking about things, right? So it's very common for engineers to have a desire to be more rigorous, be better, like do things in a stronger, more nuanced, more sustainable, higher quality way, whatever. But they don't feel like the group or their management would say yes to this. And pretty much everyone is saying the same thing, right? We have infinite number of new managers that haven't actually been given any training in leadership, especially technical leadership. And so they don't know that it's okay to have these types of discussions. They didn't see it modeled for themselves. So they're not starting it. And then everyone on the team is like, I wish that we were doing better, but I don't want to rock the boat. And so no one does. And it just kind of goes unsaid, even though everyone actually would agree with it. Learn to have discussions about your values, technical values to start. And the easiest thing is not going to be, column limits or tabs versus spaces. Those get bad. But I really start with the campsite rule, right? The idea of leave the code better than you found it. So one of the bits of homework that I really like to give teams is to focus on learning to have values discussions. And you don't want to start with the complicated stuff about, personal identity and all of those things that are going to be there's a lot of feelings and a lot of anxiety in that space. It's important. You should get there, but probably not the place to start. I like technical discussions. And again, there's some traps there. Tabs versus spaces or column limits are things that are not going to go great. But one that's really easy to start with, but is a technical value, is the campsite rule, right? You should leave the code better than you found it. So, find 10 or 15 minutes in team stand-ups or meetings or whatever, and ask as a hypothetical, like, okay, I spent a full day to implement this feature or fix this bug or whatever. And now, knowing what I know in retrospect, could have done that in 2 hours. How much time should I commit to drive by, sort of make the code better than you found it for that sort of scenario? And most teams are going to agree that they want somewhere between 1, 2, maybe 3 hours of tidy it up for an event like that. And if you don't have that discussion and get that agreement open and in everyone's head, then the safe thing is always you kind of pay lip service to the campsite rule, and in practice, no one does anything, right? And it just gets worse and worse and worse, and then you're like, everything's terrible, we have to rewrite. That's not the answer, right?
Right.
And so just learning how to agree with the team, raise these questions, have the time for that, codify those pieces, hold yourself to those higher standards, right? Then just kind of puts everyone on the same footing, lets them know what their actual expectations are, right? And that drives down the anxiety level and the what-ifism and the, hey, I don't see anyone else doing this, so I'm not going to do this, right? And it doesn't feel like going out on a limb to do a higher quality code review or actually start writing tests that you should be writing, or find the right fix, or clean up, the messy design that made that, bug take 4 times longer than it should have.
Right.
right?
Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about managers, right? I think obviously they
Okay.
play a big role in all of these things
Yeah.
too. So honestly, I don't envy them. Managers' life has been
Yeah.
pretty messy in the last 5 years, right? Like started from remote work,
Yeah.
kind of like just the whole world changed entirely, and then like especially with AI now, kind of like everything is very fuzzy and unclear. I would say one big insurgence that has happened is just like productivity metrics.
Yeah.
There has been uh, almost like a need to measure every possible thing to the extent like I heard from one company they even measure what all git commands a developer is running on their computers. So going from there, I would want to at least like understand like there is a little bit of insecurity
Yeah.
among managers also to really understand how my team is doing, right? And kind of like how does that play into cultural aspects and how does that play into like psychological safety of the team members?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back to like metrics also, like how do we actually like work through the metrics and what are sort of like are there like some principles around it?
Right. I'm going to go again to a stat that came out of a Cat Hicks research bit, where surveying a lot of managers and asking them, do you have enough visibility into what your team is doing to fairly judge their effort and, evaluate performance? Managers believe, it's like I think it's 88% of managers think that they have enough context and that that's a critical part of their job. And amongst engineers, that number is like low 20s, right? Which I think also speaks directly to the fear and culture questions, right? Because if the person that's responsible for performance reviews and promotions and bonuses and all of those things, if you're one of the 4 in 5 engineers that doesn't think your manager knows enough of what you're doing to judge those things correctly, then you're probably going to do a lot of performative nonsense work that looks effortful, but isn't necessarily the thing that gets stuff done. And to the broader point of like, how do we measure? How do we evaluate? I'm gonna be a little heterodox, unorthodox on this, and like I hate like laser focus on we got to measure things. Like there's so much false, like false evidence, false legibility is a term that comes up here. There's this mindset that's been pervasive in the West for 100 years of when something is very complicated, we see all of the complexity in it as hiding some sort of truth, and that the true underlying value could be known if we could just get rid of all of the noise. But all of the noise and chaos is actually the value in so many of our systems, especially like team dynamics and stuff like that, that when you narrow it down to, oh, I'm just going to measure this one thing and that will be representative, you lose all of the nuance and credibility. Like we're way too obsessed with numbers and averages and net promoter scores and Likert scales and all of that stuff. Whereas if you like want to know if your team's doing a good job, like go ask them how effective do you think we're doing compared to that team? Go get peer reviews from other teams, from your clients. Like talk to people. Stop pretending that you can average everything, because the holistic sort of gestalt understanding is going to be a lot more accurate and nuanced. And even in the like frameworks where we're talking about productivity and measurement and stuff, the space framework, the space paper is a common touchstone.
Mm-hmm.
The space paper, if I was summarizing the thesis of the space paper, there's not one measurement that's going to do this for you, and you need at least 3 from these different categories, and at least one of them better be qualitative because you need to ask your humans how things are going, right? And we need to learn that lesson. There's a paper that I'm working on with one of my former Google colleagues that we're hoping that goes to ACMQ soon. but it's mostly about like reasoning about impact and productivity and value in the workflow at the like organizational level. And one of the, I think, really important points in there is when you look at DORA metrics, DORA is doing a great job of what it's doing because it's specifically just measuring the factory part of the process. Like there is no theoretical reason for a human to be in the loop at all after you have merged to main, right? From that point on, your testing and verification and release process is theoretically automatable, right? It's just a factory process. So all human involvement there is theoretically waste, and it will never actually drop to zero. SRE exists for reasons, and but like we shouldn't be tolerant of there being a ton of human involvement in the loop there. But all of the stuff that dev teams are spending most of their time on is human processes. Like I can't define what's a feature. I can't define what's a comparable unit of what's the unit of productivity. Like it's not one PR. That's way too high variance,
Right.
And so we make the point, like it's much more like a car brand, from the factory onward. Like yes, this is just factory process, but the development process is much more like car design, and efficiency in those spaces is going to come from having a common set of tools and design systems, having like reusable components, and having the space to be appropriately constrained and creative at the same time, right? Finding those balances. But if you try to treat your people like they're the factory process, you're not going to get good work. You're going to like overly reduce to silly measures. And it's not going to be motivating or representative. So
Interesting. I'm going to try to be a little bit more specific here, like for the audience,
Sorry.
the audience who are like, managers. No, this is actually like still great, right? I mean, it's still kind of like helpful to understand the framework, but let's think about like, from the shoes of a manager, right? Part of the reason I say I don't envy them, it's like, their life is hard too, because they have to prove out like as a team, we are performing well.
Yeah.
And like even to the leadership kind of like, this is like the impact we are making for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's like one part is like, okay, are we meeting our expectations on the goals that we are setting ourselves?
Yeah.
But like I think part of it is always, sure, you can set like lower goals and meet those expectations and you can still be okay.
Right.
Like how do you know as a manager that you're running a high performing team? And like is there a way to kind of like, objectively define that?
I don't think that there is a way to objectively define that. I think that shifts over time because we're getting better. Like productivity expectations go up as we get better workflow and tools and process. So it's not like even if I had a definition for it today, it wouldn't last more than a handful of years anyway. But to the broader question of how do you know if you're running a high performing team? Go into it a little skeptically and ask a lot of questions to your partner teams, to the people whose infrastructure you rely on, to the customer teams or the clients, paying customers in the public. Like, how is it going, right? And you can't rely on just a Likert scale, like, sorry, Uber and Lyft have ruined the 5-star scale. Like, this is not, there's no useful signal in there. Like, go talk to people. Be skeptical. Go poke in the corners that you're afraid to go poke in to get the honest feedback that you actually need. And then, try to synthesize from there, like how well are we actually doing? Most of the time, you will know if you're on a team that's really doing it. Like the times where I've been on a team that was incredibly high performing, the buzz is amazing. Like it's a emotional high. The reputation that your team has in the org around you is obvious. Like it'll make itself pretty clear. If it's not obvious that you're already doing that, then for the manager, I would argue there's probably some fear of understanding how bad is it? Where are we missing the bar? And for that, you're going to do better. Just go ask people, talk to people more, rely on things you can average less.
Interesting. Okay. I know we are coming close to time, but I at least want to cover one other topic, which is technical debt.
Ooh.
Right. So obviously this could be a whole can of worms itself.
Oh, yeah.
But maybe we can try to kind of at least do a high level sweep on this. So how does technical debt play into psychological safety? And kind of there's obviously scare of oh, I don't want to touch this code because I'm going to break something. Right. So how does that play into psychological safety, and what can teams do about it to get over it?
So I very often say a lot of the wisdom in software engineering these days actually comes from site reliability engineering, because the SREs have had a very high pressure need to figure out how to do these things at scale in a sustainable fashion, for the last 15 years. So once again, I'm just going to cite SRE. SRE has a rule: no haunted graveyards. Right? If there are those systems that you're afraid to touch or to restart or to make any modifications to because it's just full of spooky ghosts, we can't let fear dominate our engineering decisions. It's not an option. It's a requirement to go bust those ghosts. You have to go reconsecrate the graveyard, right? Figure out what it takes to make that a system that isn't scary to change. I've been giving variations on this talk for a long time now. I think we don't talk enough about the expected lifespan of our systems. If I ask, what's the expected lifespan of the code you're working on right now? There are 6 orders of magnitude of acceptable, believable answer to that, right? It could be you're throwing this away in minutes because it's some shell script, Python script, whatever, to zip through some log files and then you're done with it. Or it could be code that's going into the Linux kernel or the Apache web server or Photoshop, and it's going to live for decades. And obviously we're going to have different best practices on both ends of that spectrum. The problem is all of our university training and boot camps and all of our formal education is on very short projects. Your code doesn't live longer than a week or so. And so very few of us, I think, in practice spend a lot of time on a system that is both actually sustainable, can be modified in the ways that it needs to be modified on an ongoing basis, and that knows that it's going to be around for at least 5 or 10 years and is taking steps to stay flexible and current and all of that. And the tech debt issue is, in a lot of cases, from we didn't plan for how this is going to change. Sometimes it's we took some shortcuts. I don't think it's all shortcuts, but sometimes it is. And a lot of it kind of boils down to, from a management perspective, you cannot have your team assigned 100%, running full tilt on next feature, next urgent thing. A healthy fuel mixture here. You need a balance between what's urgent and not urgent. All of it should be important, but there needs to be a balance on urgent and not urgent. And so I often tell leaders, aim for 70-30 or maybe 80-20, right? You need 20 or 30% reserve for important, not urgent stuff. Tech debt, values discussions, education, team bonding, overhead, the things that make teams better at their job, and then spend the rest of the time on doing the job, right? But if you're running full tilt on just try to produce with no focus on get better, that is a recipe for burnout and a recipe for horrible technical debt. And it's not going to work.
Right. Interesting. All right. So maybe one last question to wrap it up. Obviously, kind of as I said, development, software engineering is changing
Yes.
very rapidly.
Yeah.
Obviously, AI is a very big part of that as well.
Sure.
How do you, if you have kind of like, if you're to bet or like think about like, what's going to happen in the near future, how do you think kind of like all of this will play out in terms of like psychological safety, engineering culture, and like the fear in tech?
I'm hopeful, actually, that a lot of the generative AI in code and in software engineering spaces gives us a little bit more time and attention to focus on how do we do our job, whether it's with Gen AI or not, right? Because again, like right now it's a hot topic, and even execs and leaders are like, putting in time and effort to think about Copilot and Cursor and licensing and all of this stuff. And most of the time they don't care about your IDEs, but like it's part of the discourse now. So let's use that as an opportunity to have some discourse, not just about the AI tools, but about all of the working environment, like whether that's culture or tech debt or testing or code review or AI tools, IDEs, whatever. Because in the end, it's really just all about like, what does it take to be more productive? So many organizations, like your number one expense is paychecks. And yet we're like abominable at like penny pinching to avoid doing something that would actually make the developer more productive. That just blows my mind. There's like so much, pound wise, penny foolish sort of behavior there.
Amazing, Titus. I know we are living in definitely an amazing time. Like this is like really, truly the evolution of software engineering at its peak. I'm very excited for like excited
one
as
of
well as
many. One of many. I mean, everyone had just as much panic of like, am I going to lose my job? In the 80s when we started having higher level languages, 70s and 80s, like COBOL, C++, these are going to put programmers out of a job because we don't have to write assembly anymore. It practically writes itself. Like, no, you're just going to have different tools. We still need to write better code, and we'll still need, it's fine.
Right. But yeah, like, even like the speed of software engineering is changing pretty fast, right? Like you see a lot of like new things coming up every month, every week, every day. And I think that is definitely like a very, very exciting time to be in.
True.
This industry.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much. This was really fun. And I'm sure like we'll want to do at some point another session on this. But
Glad
I think
to do it.
Right now we are out of time. So have a great day. Thank you for your time. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, all.